The help should stay invisible, my daughter-in-law said into the microphone, smiling as if she were making a harmless joke, and the entire ballroom laughed before I even understood she was talking about me. I had spent the last 3 hours arranging crystal glasses on linen-covered tables that cost more than my first car, adjusting place cards with trembling fingers while servers half my age rushed past in tailored black uniforms that actually fit them. Mine did not. Mine hung loose around my shoulders, smelling faintly of industrial detergent and someone else's perfume. The chandeliers above us shimmered like frozen stars, reflecting in the polished marble floor that had become more familiar to me than the living room in my own son's house. I kept my head down the way Sophie had taught me. Smile. Move quickly. Don't speak unless spoken to. At 68, I had learned to fold myself into smaller and smaller spaces until I barely recognized the woman I used to be. Michael called it helping out. Sophie called it earning your keep. I called it temporary. Everything was temporary, I told myself, even humiliation. When the guests began to arrive, wrapped in silk and confidence, I stepped back against the wall and watched them greet my son like he had always belonged in rooms like this. He looked taller in his tuxedo, richer somehow, like success had given him permission to forget where he came from. I wondered if he could see me from across the room, or if I had finally become part of the decor, just another silent fixture placed for convenience. Someone brushed past me carrying a tray of champagne flutes, and I reached out instinctively to steady the wobbling glass before it could fall. My hand shook. I hadn't eaten since morning. The kitchen had been too busy, too loud, and besides, Sophie didn't like me lingering where the real staff worked. She said I made them uncomfortable. She said I asked too many questions. The band struck up a soft jazz melody that curled through the air like memory, and for a moment I closed my eyes. There was a time when music meant dancing barefoot in the living room, when laughter echoed through a house that still felt like mine. There was a time when my name was printed on invitations instead of hidden behind service doors. Elizabeth. The voice cut through the noise with surgical precision, quiet yet impossible to ignore. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to see a waiter needing directions or Sophie ready to hand me another list of tasks. Instead, I saw a man standing perfectly still in the center of the ballroom, his gaze fixed on my face as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had waited decades to finish. He was older now, silver-threaded through dark hair, the kind of presence that made conversations pause mid-sentence without anyone understanding why. His suit was simple, almost understated, but the way people instinctively gave him space told me everything I needed to know. Power had a temperature. It cooled the air around it. "Is that really you?" he whispered, more to himself than to me, and something inside my chest shifted, like a door I had nailed shut long ago had suddenly been pushed open from the other side. I glanced around, certain he must be mistaken. No one in this room was looking at me unless they needed their water refilled. No one had said my name with that kind of disbelief in years. Sophie appeared beside him almost instantly, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Whitmore, I hope everything is perfect tonight," she said, her hand lightly touching his sleeve in a gesture she had practiced in mirrors. "If you need anything at all, our staff will take care of it." Our staff. The words landed between us like a verdict. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the stage where Michael was shaking hands with investors who would determine the future of his company. He only looked at me, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt seen in a way that was both terrifying and strangely familiar. I became acutely aware of the tray still clutched in my hands, of the way my knuckles had whitened around its polished edge. My reflection wavered in the surface of the champagne, distorted and unrecognizable. Somewhere in the distance, laughter erupted again, loud and careless. Sophie leaned closer to me, her voice dropping into the tone she reserved for instructions she expected me to follow without question. "Stop staring and go check the coat room," she murmured. "And please try to stay out of sight. This is an important night." I nodded. Automatically. Years of habit were difficult to break. But as I turned to leave, the man reached out, not touching me, just enough to make me pause. "Elizabeth Carter," he said, more firmly now, as if testing the weight of the name. I knew I wasn't imagining things. The tray felt suddenly heavier than anything I had carried in my life, and for the first time that evening, I wondered whether the role I had been playing was about to end, Whether the invisible lines that had kept me confined to the edges of other people's lives were beginning to fade under the unforgiving brightness of recognition. The coat room smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne, a quiet contrast to the glittering chaos of the ballroom I had just left behind, and as I hung the last mink-lined wrap on a polished brass hook, I realized my hands were still trembling, not from exhaustion this time but from the way my name had sounded when he said it, like it still belonged to me. Like it had not been reduced to a whispered instruction or a sharp correction delivered across a kitchen counter. I stood there longer than necessary, smoothing invisible wrinkles from sleeves that did not need my attention, listening to the muffled swell of music and applause through the thick wooden door. Somewhere out there, my son was raising a glass to success that had cost me more than he would ever understand. I remembered the first time Michael had practiced a speech in front of me at our small dining table, his voice cracking with nerves while I nodded encouragingly, pretending not to notice how his hands shook just like mine did now. Back then he had asked for my opinion. Back then, he had still believed I had something valuable to give. The memory slipped away like breath on cold glass, leaving only the sharp clarity of the present. When I finally stepped back into the corridor, a junior event coordinator hurried past me carrying a clipboard and speaking rapidly into a headset about seating adjustments and timing cues. And I wondered what it must feel like to move through life with that kind of certainty, that unquestioned purpose. Sophie had told me earlier that evening to remain in the background, to make sure guests never had to wait for anything, to anticipate needs before they were spoken aloud. She had a way of issuing instructions that made obedience feel like the only logical response. Even now I could almost hear her voice guiding my steps toward the service elevator, toward the narrow hallway where catering staff shared lukewarm coffee from paper cups and compared notes about demanding clients. Instead, I paused near the tall windows overlooking the city, drawn by the sight of rain beginning to fall in delicate silver threads that blurred the lights below into something softer, almost forgiving. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine walking straight out of the building, hailing a cab, disappearing into the anonymity of night without explaining anything to anyone. The idea felt both liberating and impossible. Habit was a powerful anchor. You always did prefer the quiet corners. His voice again, closer this time, carried no accusation, only a strange mixture of recognition and disbelief that made my heart beat harder against my ribs. I turned slowly, conscious of every detail that separated the woman he remembered from the one standing before him now. Lines at the corners of my eyes. Silver where there had once been dark chestnut waves. The uniform that erased any lingering trace of the life I had built and then abandoned piece by piece. Daniel Whitmore stopped a few feet away, giving me space as if he sensed I might vanish if he came any nearer. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The rain tapped gently against the glass like an impatient reminder that time did not pause for reunions. "I thought you were living in Boston," he said finally, his tone careful, respectful. "After the firm dissolved, I tried to find you." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through memories I had spent decades learning not to revisit. Boston. The office on Tremont Street with its worn leather chairs and late nights fueled by takeout coffee. The exhilaration of watching numbers transform into opportunity, of believing that the future was something we could shape with enough determination. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how long it had been since anyone had spoken to me about that part of my life. "Plans change," I replied quietly. My voice sounded unfamiliar to my own ears, thinner than I remembered yet steadier than I expected. He studied my face as though searching for the woman he had once trusted with decisions that carried million-dollar consequences. Behind him, laughter echoed down the hallway, followed by the clink of glasses and the distant swell of applause. The world he inhabited continued to spin at its usual dizzying speed, while mine seemed suspended in a fragile pocket of time. "You should not be carrying trays tonight," he said after a moment, not unkindly, simply stating a fact that felt both obvious and deeply complicated. I almost smiled at that. There were so many things I should not have been doing for so many years that the list had become meaningless. "Life has a way of rearranging priorities," I answered. Somewhere inside me, an old instinct stirred. The one that had once helped me navigate boardrooms filled with men who underestimated quiet women. It whispered that recognition could be dangerous, that being seen meant being asked questions I might not be ready to answer. Yet as I met his gaze again, I sensed something else unfolding, something that had nothing to do with pity or nostalgia. It felt like the first shift of wind before a long-delayed storm, subtle but undeniable, and for the first time since stepping into that ballroom, I wondered whether the invisible boundaries I had accepted as permanent were beginning to loosen under the weight of a past that refused to remain buried. Daniel did not follow me when I finally turned away from the window, yet I could feel his presence lingering behind me like an unfinished sentence as I returned to the ballroom carrying a fresh tray of champagne that seemed lighter now. Not because its weight had changed but because something inside me had shifted, something subtle and unsettling that made every step feel like part of a decision I had not consciously made. The music had grown louder, the tempo faster, and the guests were clustering near the stage where Michael stood beside a projection screen displaying rising graphs and confident promises about the future of his company. His voice steady, practiced, belonging to a man who believed success was the natural reward for hard work, rather than the fragile outcome of sacrifices made by people whose names were never mentioned in speeches. I moved between tables with careful precision, refilling glasses, collecting napkins, maintaining the quiet efficiency Sophie expected, yet I found myself noticing details I had trained myself to ignore over the past 2 years. The way investors leaned forward when Michael spoke, hungry for certainty. The way Sophie laughed at exactly the right moments, her hand resting possessively on his arm, as if she were both partner and gatekeeper to the life they had built together. The way my own reflection in the mirrored column appeared smaller than the chandeliers above me, reduced to motion and obligation. A waiter brushed against my shoulder and apologized quickly, mistaking me for one of his colleagues, and I realized with surprising calm that I no longer felt the sharp sting of correction. Perhaps because for the first time in a very long while, someone had called me by my full name without hesitation or condescension. When the applause began, it rolled across the ballroom like distant thunder, swelling as Michael concluded his presentation with a confident smile that had once belonged to the boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the backyard. I remembered kneeling beside him on the kitchen floor, helping him build elaborate towers out of wooden blocks, both of us laughing when they inevitably collapsed. Back then, failure had been temporary and shared. Now success seemed solitary, guarded by security badges and private conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room. "There you are." Sophie's voice cut through my thoughts as she appeared at my side, her expression bright for the benefit of nearby guests yet tight enough for me to recognize the warning beneath it. "Mr. Whitmore is asking questions. Try not to say anything unnecessary if he speaks to you again." I nodded automatically, the old reflex still strong, but her words stirred a quiet resistance I had not expected. Unnecessary. As though my life could be summarized in that single dismissive category. She handed me a folded list of last-minute requests from the catering manager and moved away before I could respond, already turning her attention to a group of donors whose approval she cultivated with tireless precision. I unfolded the paper and read the neat bullet points without really seeing them, aware instead of a growing awareness that the rules governing my existence might not be as fixed as I had believed. The band transitioned into a slower melody, couples drifting toward the dance floor with the practiced ease of people who had never questioned their right to occupy space. I carried empty glasses back toward the service corridor, pausing when I noticed Daniel standing near the edge of the crowd, observing everything with the focused stillness of a man accustomed to identifying patterns others overlooked. Our eyes met briefly, and in that silent exchange I sensed both curiosity and calculation, as though he were measuring the distance between the woman he remembered and the one navigating this unfamiliar landscape of obligation. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me now. Regret. Possibility. A story interrupted too soon. The corridor beyond the ballroom felt narrower than before, the fluorescent lights harsher against polished tile, and I set the tray down on a stainless steel counter with more force than necessary, startling a young dishwasher who glanced at me with mild concern before returning to his task. I washed my hands slowly at the industrial sink, watching water spiral toward the drain, thinking about all the choices that had led me here. Marriage that had promised stability and delivered compromise. Dreams postponed until they became memories. The gradual erosion of independence disguised as devotion. Behind me, the kitchen door swung open and closed in a steady rhythm, releasing bursts of laughter, orders, the clatter of plates. Life continued, indifferent to personal revelations. Yet beneath the noise I felt a quiet determination taking shape, fragile but unmistakable, like the first outline of dawn after a sleepless night. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, drying my hands on a paper towel that disintegrated slightly under pressure, I caught my reflection in a small convex mirror mounted near the ceiling for security purposes. The image was distorted, curved at the edges, yet something in my expression looked unexpectedly resolute. I realized then that recognition had not only reopened a door to the past, it had also illuminated a path forward I had been too afraid to consider, and as the music swelled once more from the ballroom, I understood with sudden clarity that the role I had accepted without question was no longer the only one available to me. The ballroom had begun to thin by the time I returned from the service corridor, the air now carrying the warm fatigue of celebration rather than its earlier electric anticipation, and as I moved quietly between half-emptied tables gathering stray glasses and folded programs, I noticed how different everything looked when viewed without the pressure to disappear completely. Conversations sounded softer, less intimidating. Laughter no longer struck me like a reminder of exclusion but like distant whether I could choose to step out of if I wished. Michael stood near the stage speaking to a cluster of investors, his posture relaxed, his smile confident in the way that comes from believing the future is predictable. Sophie hovered nearby, her eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency, ensuring that every interaction served a purpose. I wondered if she had always been this vigilant, or if success had sharpened her instincts into something resembling strategy. A waiter passed me a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres and asked if I could take them back to the kitchen. I nodded and accepted the task, grateful for the brief retreat it offered. The hallway beyond the ballroom felt quieter now, almost contemplative, the hum of refrigeration units and distant clatter of dishes creating a steady rhythm that grounded my thoughts. I set the tray down on a metal counter and leaned lightly against the cool surface, allowing myself a rare moment of stillness. Recognition had a way of rearranging memories, pulling forgotten scenes into sharper focus whether one welcomed them or not. I could see it all with unsettling clarity. The office in Boston with its tall windows overlooking the Charles River, sunlight glinting off water like scattered coins. The thrill of late-night negotiations fueled by black coffee and unspoken ambition. Daniel pacing beside a whiteboard filled with projections, arguing passionately about risk and reward while I listened, calculated, suggested alternatives he had not yet considered. We had believed then that intelligence and discipline could outmaneuver circumstance. That partnership once forged would endure whatever storms the market or life might bring. Then came the quiet unraveling that followed my marriage, the subtle shifts in priority that felt temporary at first. I had told myself I would return once Michael was older, once stability was secured, once love had proven itself resilient enough to support both dreams and responsibility. Instead, years passed with astonishing speed. Letters went unanswered. Phone calls became rarer. Opportunities dissolved like mist at sunrise. By the time I understood the permanence of what I had surrendered, the world I had helped build had moved on without me. A door swung open behind me, releasing a burst of laughter from the prep area, and I straightened instinctively, smoothing my uniform as though preparing for inspection. Old habits clung stubbornly even as new thoughts began to take root. Daniel appeared in the doorway a moment later, his expression thoughtful rather than intrusive, as if he had been weighing the ethics of following me before finally deciding that unfinished conversations demanded resolution. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he studied the orderly rows of silverware and stacked plates, the fluorescent light reflecting off polished surfaces with clinical honesty. "You disappeared," he said at last, not accusing, simply stating a fact that carried more weight than any judgment. I met his gaze, aware that explanations formed in layers too complex for casual exchange. "I chose a different life," I replied. The words sounded calm, measured, yet beneath them lay the echo of compromises made in quiet kitchens and crowded waiting rooms, decisions shaped by devotion rather than ambition. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging both the truth and its consequences. "And are you content with that choice?" he asked. The question lingered between us like a suspended note. Contentment. I searched for it among the routines that had defined my days, the careful budgeting, the polite deference, the gradual shrinking of expectations. I thought of mornings spent making coffee in a house that did not feel like mine, of evenings listening to conversations that excluded me even when I sat at the same table. I thought of tonight, of hearing my name spoken with recognition instead of obligation. I believed I was I answered honestly. Until recently. Somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, the band began playing again, a slower melody this time, one that invited reflection rather than applause. Daniel glanced toward the sound and then back at me, his expression carrying a flicker of the determination I remembered from long ago. Life has a way of offering second chapters, he said quietly, but they require courage to begin. I absorbed his words without responding, aware that courage was not something one summoned on command. It grew gradually, nourished by moments of clarity and the unsettling realization that endurance alone was no longer enough. As I picked up the tray and turned toward the ballroom once more, I felt the weight of possibility settle over my shoulders like an unfamiliar garment, heavy yet strangely fitting, and for the first time since stepping into that glittering room hours earlier, I understood that the story I had been living might be closer to transformation than resignation. The final guests began drifting toward the exits just as I stepped back into the ballroom, their laughter softer now, conversations wrapped in the comfortable fatigue of people who believed the evening had gone exactly as planned, and I moved through the lingering clusters with a quiet awareness that something within me no longer matched the role I had been performing all night. The chandeliers still glowed with unwavering brilliance, casting long reflections across the polished marble floor, yet the spectacle felt distant, almost theatrical, as though I were observing a scene I had once rehearsed but no longer wished to repeat. I carried the tray with steady hands, noticing how my steps had grown more deliberate, less apologetic, as if an invisible line had been crossed without ceremony. Michael caught sight of me near the dessert table, and gave a brief nod that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal. It was difficult to tell. His attention quickly returned to a conversation about quarterly projections, his voice low and confident, punctuated by measured laughter. Sophie approached moments later, her expression composed yet sharpened by a flicker of irritation she did not bother to conceal now that the room was nearly empty. "You disappeared earlier," she said quietly, adjusting a centerpiece that did not need adjusting. "Mr. Whitmore asked several questions about you. It would be better if you kept interactions professional. We cannot afford misunderstandings." I studied her face, the flawless makeup, the precise control she maintained over every situation, and for the first time I wondered whether she felt threatened or merely inconvenienced by the idea that my presence might carry significance beyond household duties. "I will remember that," I replied, my voice calm enough to surprise us both. She hesitated as if expecting more, then turned away to supervise the final details of departure, already calculating tomorrow's advantages. The band packed their instruments with efficient silence, and the scent of extinguished candles lingered in the air like the aftertaste of celebration. I gathered a stack of unused programs and set them beside the exit, glancing once more at the stage where Michael had stood earlier declaring his vision for the future. There had been a time when I believed I was part of that future, when late nights balancing budgets and reviewing contracts had felt like an investment in our shared success. The memory no longer hurt as sharply as it once had. Perhaps because recognition had introduced a different perspective, one that reframed sacrifice as choice rather than inevitability. Near the coat check, Daniel waited with the patience of someone accustomed to negotiations that unfolded over months or years. He held his overcoat draped across one arm, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as if he understood that timing mattered more than urgency. When I approached, he offered a small, almost private smile that carried echoes of conference rooms and strategy sessions long past. "I would like to continue our conversation," he said. "Not tonight. Tomorrow morning. There is a cafe on Beacon Street that still serves coffee strong enough to wake the past." The invitation felt both simple and profound, a bridge extending from one chapter of my life to another. I considered the routines awaiting me at dawn, the grocery lists and laundry schedules, the quiet expectations that had shaped my days into predictable patterns. Then I thought of the way my name had sounded in his voice, not as obligation but as recognition. "I remember that place," I said. The admission surprised me with its warmth. He nodded as though we had just confirmed a shared understanding rather than arranged a meeting. We stood there for a moment longer, watching as the final guests stepped into waiting cars, their silhouettes dissolving into the rain-washed city lights. Somewhere inside, Sophie called instructions to the remaining staff, her tone brisk and efficient. Michael's laughter echoed faintly from a corridor leading to private elevators. Life continued in carefully constructed circles. Yet as I slipped my own worn coat over my shoulders, I felt a quiet certainty settle into place, steady as a heartbeat. Change rarely announced itself with fanfare. It arrived in small decisions, in meetings accepted instead of declined, in memories allowed to surface rather than remain buried. When I stepped outside, the cool night air carried the scent of wet pavement and possibility. Streetlights stretched into shimmering lines along the avenue, guiding me toward a taxi stand where yellow cabs idled with patient engines. I paused beneath the awning, listening to the rhythm of rain against fabric, aware that tomorrow might demand answers I had postponed for decades. For the first time, the thought did not frighten me. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something unfinished finally insisting on completion, and as I raised my hand to signal a driver, I realized that the path ahead, uncertain as it was, belonged to me once more. The taxi ride home unfolded in a quiet blur of rain-streaked windows and muted city lights, the driver humming softly to a radio station I did not recognize while the familiar skyline slipped past like a memory I was only beginning to reclaim, and I sat in the back seat with my hands folded neatly in my lap, aware that the evening had altered something fundamental within me, even though the world outside remained stubbornly unchanged. When we reached the modest townhouse where I had lived for the past 2 years, I paid the fare carefully, counting each bill with the same discipline that had once guided million-dollar negotiations, and stepped onto the damp sidewalk with a strange sense of anticipation rather than the usual fatigue that followed long nights of invisible labor. The porch light flickered as I unlocked the door, casting uneven shadows across the narrow hallway that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and resignation. Inside, the house was silent except for the distant hum of a refrigerator, and the ticking of a wall clock that had marked countless evenings of polite conversation and unspoken distance. I removed my coat and hung it on the same hook where Sophie insisted all outerwear must be placed, aligning the sleeves with habitual precision before moving toward the kitchen to pour a glass of water. The routine felt both comforting and insufficient, like a script that no longer matched the story unfolding in my thoughts. I sat at the small wooden table near the window and watched raindrops gather on the glass, remembering another table in another city where decisions had once felt expansive instead of restrictive. Daniel's invitation lingered in my mind with quiet insistence, not as a rescue but as a reminder that unfinished chapters could still demand resolution. I realized then that fear had been my most faithful companion over the years, guiding choices disguised as devotion, encouraging compromises that slowly reshaped my identity into something easier for others to manage. The realization did not arrive with drama or regret. It settled gently like the first light before dawn. Footsteps sounded on the staircase above, followed by the soft creak of a bedroom door. Sophie appeared moments later, wrapped in a silk robe that whispered confidence with every movement. She paused when she saw me sitting there, surprise flickering briefly across her face before composure returned. "You are still awake," she observed, her tone neutral yet edged with curiosity. I nodded and took another sip of water, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to feel intentional. "I have plans tomorrow morning," I said. The words felt unfamiliar and unexpectedly powerful, like testing a muscle that had not been used in years. She raised an eyebrow, perhaps waiting for an explanation that did not come. "Please remember that we have a meeting with the contractor at 10, she replied after a moment. "Your presence is expected." I met her gaze calmly, noticing for the first time how much energy I had once invested in anticipating her reactions. "I will not be available," I said. There was no defiance in my voice, only clarity. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as though measuring the weight of that simple sentence. Sophie studied me as if reassessing a piece of furniture she had always taken for granted, then gave a short nod and turned away without further comment. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it reverberated through the quiet house with unexpected force. When she disappeared upstairs, I remained at the table, listening to the rain soften into a gentle mist that blurred the outlines of neighboring homes. For the first time in a long while, tomorrow felt like something I could approach rather than endure. I rinsed my glass and set it carefully in the drying rack, noticing how deliberate each movement had become, as if intention itself were a new language I was learning to speak. Later, in the small guest room that had gradually become mine by default, I lay awake beneath a thin blanket, replaying fragments of the evening with a clarity sharpened by recognition. The chandeliers. Michael's confident voice. Daniel's quiet certainty. My own reflection in a convex mirror revealing a determination I had not known still existed. Sleep came slowly but without the familiar undercurrent of dread. Instead there was a steady awareness that something long postponed was finally beginning to take shape, and as the first pale light filtered through the curtains, I understood that the meeting on Beacon Street would not simply reconnect me with the past. It would challenge me to decide who I intended to be for whatever future remained. Morning arrived with a pale gray light that seemed to carry the quiet promise of decisions long deferred, and as I dressed carefully in the small guest room that had become my refuge, I noticed how deliberate each movement felt, as though even the simple act of choosing a blouse and smoothing its sleeves had become part of a larger preparation I could no longer postpone. The house was unusually still, the kind of stillness that settles after a night of rain when the world has not yet decided what shape the day will take. I moved down the staircase with measured steps, aware that for the first time in years, I was not planning my morning around the needs and expectations of others. The kitchen clock read 7:15. Its steady ticking marking a departure from routines that had once governed every hour. I brewed coffee with practiced precision, inhaling the familiar aroma, as if reacquainting myself with a life that had existed before compromise became second nature. Outside, the sky hung low over neat rows of suburban rooftops, damp pavement reflecting muted sunlight in long uncertain streaks. I sat at the table where I had spent countless mornings reviewing grocery lists and utility bills, and instead allowed my thoughts to travel back to Beacon Street, to a cafe that had once been our unofficial headquarters during the early years of ambition and improbable success. The memory arrived fully formed. Tall windows framed in dark wood. Marble-top tables crowded with legal pads and financial projections. The clatter of cups punctuating debates about strategy and risk. Daniel's voice rising with conviction as we sketched futures on napkins already stained with espresso. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup, placing it upside down in the drying rack with a sense of quiet finality. When Sophie entered the kitchen a few minutes later, she paused at the sight of me already dressed, her expression flickering between curiosity and calculation. "You are leaving early," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. I nodded, fastening the clasp of a modest necklace I had not worn in years. "I have an appointment downtown," I said simply. The words felt steady, like stepping onto solid ground after years of uncertainty. She opened the refrigerator and studied its contents as though they might offer an explanation I had not provided. "Michael will expect you at the contractor meeting," she replied. I met her gaze without hesitation. "He will manage." For a moment, the silence between us carried the weight of unspoken reassessments. Then she closed the refrigerator door with a soft click and turned away, perhaps recognizing that insistence would no longer produce the compliance she had come to rely upon. The front door felt heavier than usual as I stepped outside, the morning air cool enough to sharpen my focus. I walked to the bus stop at the corner rather than calling a taxi, noticing details I had overlooked during countless similar journeys. The scent of wet leaves, the distant hum of commuter traffic, a newspaper folded neatly on a neighbor's porch. Life in its ordinary persistence. The bus arrived precisely at 7:40, its doors sighing open with mechanical patience, and I took a seat near the window, watching familiar streets give way to broader avenues lined with storefronts that hinted at possibility rather than obligation. Downtown Boston unfolded gradually, brick facades and narrow lanes giving way to the graceful curve of Beacon Street, where early sunlight finally broke through the clouds to illuminate the polished brass sign above a cafe I had not entered in decades. I stepped inside and paused just beyond the threshold, allowing the warmth and aroma of freshly ground coffee to envelop me. Nothing had changed and everything had changed. The same marble tables. The same muted hum of conversation. The same sense that decisions made within these walls could ripple outward into lives far beyond their origin. Daniel sat near the window, reading glasses balanced low on his nose as he reviewed a folder thick with documents. When he looked up and saw me, recognition softened his features into something that felt almost like relief. "I was not certain you would come," he admitted as I took the seat across from him. I folded my hands on the table, aware that this meeting represented more than nostalgia. It was an invitation to confront the consequences of choices made in another lifetime. "Neither was I," I replied. He pushed the folder gently toward me, his expression composed yet intent. "There are matters you should understand," he said. I opened it slowly. The crisp pages revealing figures, signatures, and possibilities that suggested the past had never truly released its claim on the present, and as the cafe filled with the rising energy of a new day, I realized that whatever path I chose next would no longer be shaped by quiet resignation, but by the deliberate courage to reclaim a voice I had once allowed to fade. The folder lay open between us like a map of a country I had once known by heart yet no longer trusted myself to navigate, its neatly tabbed sections revealing financial statements, partnership agreements, and letters bearing signatures I had not seen since the year I convinced myself that stepping away was only temporary, and as I turned each page with careful deliberation, I felt the quiet hum of the cafe fade into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of realization taking shape in my chest. Daniel watched without interruption, allowing silence to perform the work that explanations might only complicate. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the air like fragments of forgotten time. I recognized the logo at the top of one document immediately, the stylized compass we had chosen during a late-night debate about identity and direction. It felt surreal to see it again, crisp and official, as if the years between had been nothing more than an extended pause. You never sold your shares, Daniel said finally, his voice low enough to remain private yet firm enough to anchor the moment. I looked up, uncertain whether he was offering reassurance or revealing a complication I had yet to grasp. They remained in trust after you left, he continued. Your husband insisted on handling your affairs. After his passing, the firm attempted to reach you. The correspondence was returned unopened. A slow understanding began to unfurl, delicate yet undeniable. I remembered envelopes set aside on crowded kitchen counters, assurances that everything had been taken care of, the gradual narrowing of my world until opportunity itself felt like an indulgence I could no longer afford. The idea that a part of my former life had continued to exist, quietly accruing value and consequence, seemed almost implausible. I traced the printed figures with a fingertip, aware that they represented more than financial security. They were evidence that the woman I had been had never fully disappeared. Why show me this now? I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor of revelation beneath it. Daniel leaned back slightly, folding his hands as though considering the most honest answer. Because recognition carries responsibility, he said. And because the company you helped build is facing decisions that require the perspective you once provided without hesitation. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, momentarily obscuring the view of Beacon Street before continuing on its predictable route. Life, in all its ordinary momentum, moved forward whether we chose to engage or retreat. I closed the folder gently, absorbing the weight of possibility it contained. Memories surfaced with renewed clarity. Strategy sessions that stretched into dawn. The quiet satisfaction of outmaneuvering competitors who underestimated patience. The shared conviction that resilience could be cultivated like any other skill. I realized then that the meeting was not about nostalgia or charity. It was an invitation to reclaim authorship of a story I had allowed others to edit. What would involvement look like? I asked. Daniel's expression softened, as if relieved to hear curiosity rather than resistance. Advisory at first, he replied. There are board members who still remember your insight. They would listen. The simplicity of his confidence unsettled me more than any pressure might have. I glanced around the cafe, noting the steady stream of patrons beginning their day, the barista calling out orders with practiced warmth, ordinary people making ordinary choices. Yet here I sat with an opportunity that could reshape the landscape of my remaining years. My phone vibrated quietly inside my purse, a reminder of obligations waiting at home. I did not reach for it immediately. Instead, I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection unburdened by urgency. The past had not only found me, it had arrived bearing questions that demanded answers measured in courage rather than convenience. Daniel slid a business card across the table, its embossed lettering catching the light. Think about it, he said. I nodded, aware that thinking would no longer suffice. As I rose to leave, the folder tucked securely beneath my arm, I felt a clarity that had eluded me for decades settle into place. Outside, the city seemed sharper, more defined, as if recognition itself had altered the focus of my vision. I stepped onto the sidewalk with deliberate purpose, understanding that whatever confrontation awaited at home would be met not with quiet endurance but with the calm authority of someone who had finally rediscovered the value of her own voice. When I returned home that afternoon, the folder beneath my arm felt heavier than its modest thickness suggested, not because of the papers it contained but because of the quiet authority it now represented. And as I stepped through the front door into the familiar hallway scented with polished wood and careful control, I understood with startling clarity that something fundamental had shifted beyond the reach of negotiation. Sophie stood in the living room near the bay window, her posture rigid with impatience as she spoke into her phone about contractor delays and revised budgets, her voice precise and measured in a way that had once made me feel both grateful and diminished. She ended the call when she saw me, her gaze moving instinctively to the folder as though she could sense its significance without understanding its contents. "You missed the meeting," she said, not accusing, simply recording a deviation from routine. I removed my coat slowly and placed it on the hook with deliberate care before meeting her eyes. "I had a more important appointment," I replied. The words settled between us with the calm weight of inevitability. Michael entered from the study a moment later, loosening his tie as he glanced from Sophie to me with faint irritation. "What appointment could not wait?" he asked, his tone edged with the impatience of someone accustomed to being prioritized. I held the folder against my side, aware that explanation was no longer an act of seeking permission but of declaring intention. "One connected to a life I paused long before you learned to drive," I said quietly. They exchanged a look I recognized too well, a silent calculation about whether my statement required engagement or dismissal. For years, that look had been enough to silence me. Today it merely clarified the distance we had allowed to grow. I walked past them into the kitchen and set the folder on the table where I had spent so many mornings feeling invisible, opening it with measured precision as though conducting a ritual that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Michael followed, curiosity finally outweighing annoyance. Sophie remained in the doorway, arms folded, her expression composed yet wary. I turned the documents toward them, allowing figures and signatures to speak in the language they both respected. "There are assets in my name you were never told about," I said. Silence expanded to fill the room. Michael leaned closer, scanning the pages with a focus I had not seen directed toward me in years. His brows drew together as comprehension took hold. Sophie's composure faltered for a fraction of a second before returning in sharper form. "Why are we hearing about this now?" she asked. I considered the question without defensiveness, aware that honesty no longer required apology. "Because I am no longer willing to be reduced to convenience," I answered. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking a moment that felt both fragile and irrevocable. Michael straightened slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something more complicated, perhaps regret or reluctant respect. "What does this mean?" he said. I closed the folder with a soft, decisive motion. "It means I will be reclaiming my role in the company I helped build," I replied. "It means I will be moving out before the month ends. And it means our relationship will need to be defined by mutual regard, rather than silent expectation." Sophie opened her mouth as if to respond, then stopped, recognizing perhaps that negotiation required leverage she did not currently possess. The afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air like evidence of time itself. I picked up the folder and felt its weight settle into something resembling certainty. For the first time since crossing this threshold years ago, I did not feel like a guest awaiting instructions. I felt like the author of my next decision. Michael looked at me with an intensity that suggested he was seeing me clearly for the first time since childhood. "I did not know," he said quietly. I nodded, accepting the truth without allowing it to soften my resolve. "Now you do," I replied. Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves lining the street, their quiet motion echoing the subtle yet profound change unfolding within these walls. I walked toward the staircase to gather my belongings, aware that departure would not be dramatic or vindictive. It would be deliberate. When I reached the landing, I paused and looked back at the two people standing in the kitchen, their expressions reflecting a future none of us had anticipated. "Success without kindness is a lonely inheritance," I said gently. Then, I continued upward, carrying with me not only the folder but the restored conviction that dignity, once reclaimed, required no further justification.